For you today that I've been really looking forward to. We are going to record tonight's interview and put it on YouTube in about a week or so after a little light editing. If you are interested in asking a question in our Q&A but don't want to appear on camera, it's very simple to do so. Just type your question in the chat box, and Rachel or I will pose it to our interviewers and our author tonight. If you don't mind, if you don't mind appearing on camera, it's easy. We can also turn your mute off and let you appear and ask it yourself if you're so interested. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce a new Northshire Bookstore favorite author. That's Todd D. Snyder. He's an associate professor of rhetoric and writing at Siena College. He had a very successful event for his last book, 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym at Northshire's Saratoga Springs store. Today, he joins us to present his new book, Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype, the first biography of Muhammad Ali's hype man and boxing's greatest motivator, Drew Bundini Brown. We're joined for this event by Kyle Sarofeen, the editor of Bundini and publisher and principal of Hamilcar Publications. Kyle has worked in the book publishing industry in the Boston area for over 20 years for companies such as Houghton, Mifflin Harcourt, Quarto, and Pearson. So please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Kyle Sarofeen and Todd Snyder.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. Let me set the book up a little bit for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with it. The title of the book is Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. It is the first ever biography of Drew Bundini Brown, who was Muhammad Ali's confidant, best friend, trainer, hype man, street poet. I mean, there's a million different labels that have been used about this guy. The best way to describe who he was to sort of a non-boxing crowd is like this. Bundini was there with Muhammad Ali every day in training camp. Ali, in the early part of his career, trained at the 5th Street Gym in Miami, Florida. For the second half of his career, he trained in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, in a secluded training compound that Ali referred to as Fighter's Heaven. Bundini was there with him day in and day out, through every exercise, hitting the bag, the speed bag, the jump rope, shadowing him during sparring, barking out those motivational phrases, coming up with those routines that made Ali famous as sort of an athlete / poet. Most people know his famous line, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, the rhyme, hands can't hit what your eyes can't see. So Bundini was the guy who came up with a lot of Muhammad Ali's rhymes. He was there with him day in and day out in training camp. And he was there for every significant Muhammad Ali fight, from those Liston fights to the Joe Frazier trilogy, to the Ken Norton trilogy, to Ali's famous fight with George Foreman in Kinshasa, Zaire. Bundini was there for the whole Ali circus. He was there with him through a big part of his exile as well, when Ali refused induction into the United States Army. I was attracted to this guy and wanted to become the first person to write his story for a couple reasons. The first reason is I was the son of a boxing trainer. As you mentioned earlier, my dad, his name was Michael Snyder, and he ran a small boxing gym in West Virginia. So I grew up, my whole life was in boxing gyms, going through training camps with my dad. I boxed when I was in high school for a couple years. And after I shipped off to college, I would come home in the summers and work corners with my father and train fighters at the gym, mostly amateurs, but a few small level professionals. So the way I see the sport of boxing is through the lens of boxing trainers, because I grew up with one. So I'm the kind of guy, when I watch fights, I like to see who is in the corner. I'm very interested in trainers. I'm interested in the entourage and the training camp atmosphere. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to know more about Bundini, because he was such a big part of Ali's entourage, his life outside of the ring. For me, I was also attracted to this story because I grew up in the 80s and hip hop was sort of my first love. At Siena College, I teach a special topics course on hip hop culture. And I've always believed that Bundini and Ali were pre-hip hop icons. Those beautiful poems that Ali would come up with, mocking his opponents. He was sort of a battle rapper. He would battle you lyrically, and then he would battle you in the ring. And Bundini was a big part of that aspect of his persona. So I was always interested in Ali because my dad was a boxing trainer. Ali was his hero. And I was interested in Bundini because I felt like he was one of the first pre-hip hop, pop culture icons. Hip hop doesn't come out until a couple of decades after Muhammad Ali becomes champion. But I always felt like those two were sort of a big part of the birth of hip hop culture, you could say. So that was sort of my impetus to write this story. It was an unbelievable journey writing this book. I formed a really close personal relationship with Drew Brown III, Bundini's son. I got to interview Big George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Kalia Ali, Muhammad Ali's second wife. I got to talk to Angelo Dundee's son, who was one of Muhammad Ali's trainers. I got to interview a bunch of guys who fought Muhammad Ali. And then I also interviewed a bunch of guys who sparred Muhammad Ali in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania. Larry Holmes being Ali's sparring partner for 5 years. So he knew Bundini pretty well. It's an amazing American life. This is a book about fathers and sons. It's about friendship. Bundini was the type of guy who, he grew up in very poor circumstances in Sanford, Florida, at a time where the KKK sort of loomed large in Seminole County. He grew up pretty tough circumstances. And I think it's miraculous that a guy who came from that kind of background could make it to the corner of great fighters like Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali and travel the world, meet presidents and dictators, jazz musicians and movie stars. Bundini was a movie star as well. He starred in 6 feature films. It's just an incredible American life. I don't think you need to be a boxing fan to enjoy this story. It's about a man who overcame quite a bit in his life. And because of my background, I was very drawn to this guy. And I'm so happy that I could be the first to write a book about him. So we're telling some stories that no one's ever heard about Muhammad Ali and his sidekick, Drew Bundini Brown. So now that I've set the book up a little bit for viewers, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Sarofeen, who was my editor on the project. And he saw the manuscript through all the different stages and was there with me for the journey. So Kyle, I'll turn things over to you, buddy.
Okay, thanks, Todd. I guess first of all, I think it's a good story, like the first phone call, right? When I called you and you're in your office and you were talking about the picture that was above your desk. Maybe you could sort of talk about that, because I think that this project, Bundini had a concept of God. He called God Shorty, and I'm not the most religious person in the world, but I've over the course of this, I've come to believe that Shorty sort of had a hand in it, in us connecting with Todd. So
yeah, it all started
like picking up the phone.
It all started with Kyle. He's one of the principal publishers at Hamilcar, and in the early days of their website, he would do a little blogging, and he did a blog about Bundini being the original hype man. That's a term that comes out of hip hop culture, that a hype man is sort of the sidekick to a headlining artist. They motivate the artist and they keep the energy up in the crowd. And so Kyle had blogged about Bundini being the original hype man. And the blog received quite a bit of traffic on their website. So he and his partner, Andy, decided, thinking about, maybe there's a interest in Bundini because there's never been a book on him, only a couple articles in Sports Illustrated and Ring Magazine. So he and his business partners started looking for authors who might be able to write about Bundini. And because the blog post had been about the hype man, which is a term that comes out of hip hop, these guys are Googling hip hop and boxing. And who comes up? I do. They find me on the internet because I'm one of the few folks who writes about both. And when Kyle called me, I was in my office at Siena College. And we had that sort of initial conversation as to whether or not I would be interested in writing this story. And I told him, as I looked up, above my desk in my office at Siena College is a picture of Bundini wrapping Ali's hands. And, in my dad's gym, one of his assistant trainers, his name was Jeff Dean, and my dad nicknamed him Bundini Dean because he was my dad's sidekick. It was his right-hand man. So I had grown up sort of being interested in Bundini to the extent that I had a picture of him hanging above my desk in my office at Siena College. So Kyle calls me and asks me if I'm interested in this book. And I said, I'm looking at Bundini right now. I might be your guy for this project. And
I can add to that too with Bundini Dean. Todd's memoir, we signed him to write the book. I'd read about half of it, but sometimes I don't have the time to actually read an author's whole book, but I can sort of, I know if someone can write away, and that was the case. And I actually, halfway through the book, I came across Jeff Bundini Dean. I said, "Oh my God, no wonder this is amazing. It's too good to be true."
But what Kyle didn't know at the time, guys, is that a few years prior to this conversation, Chuck D, who was the lead rapper from the group Public Enemy, had visited Siena College. And I invited him to what we have a hip hop week at Siena every March where we celebrate hip hop culture. And he was our keynote speaker that year. Now, Chuck D was in a documentary called Ali Rap. And it was about Ali being the first rapper. So my students, when they had dinner with Chuck D, were asking him questions about Ali being the first rapper. And one of my students asked him at dinner, "Is float like a butterfly, sting like a bee the first rap lyric?" And Chuck D said, "Well, yeah, maybe it is. I think so." Or something to that effect. And I piped in and said, "Hey, then that must mean Bundini's the original hype man." And he laughed and he said, "Someone should write a book on Bundini." I'll never forget that. Chuck D said that to me across from the table. 2 years later, I get a call from Kyle Sarofeen, and he's saying, "Hey, we want you to write this book." So it did feel like Shorty had a hand in it. That was Bundini's idea for God, that idea of destiny.
One thing, Todd, that I was thinking about too, and just approaching this event, is that if you look at obviously hip hop history, Flavor Flav, sort of arguably the most well-known, arguably the greatest hype man. But if you think about boxing, in the history of boxing, there's really no one even close to Bundini, to my mind.
Yeah,
sort of isn't. Like different fighters, maybe they had a friend who motivated them, or in the boxing game, there are fathers who are almost like tennis parents who get over involved and get their sons hyped up. But there's really before and after, never anyone like him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do get that question sometimes where, who would you compare him to today? Well, I interviewed Tim Witherspoon, who was the former heavyweight champion who used to spar with Ali. And Tim said to me, "There was never a Bundini before Bundini, and there hasn't been one since." But guys, one of the funny things about this man is not only did he work with the great Sugar Ray Robinson for 7 years, and some people say Sugar Ray's the greatest fighter of all time. He worked for Ali with Ali for 20 years. Bundini never boxed as an amateur. He never boxed as a professional. And his own son said to me, he didn't have an athletic bone in his body. He said he went to a family reunion one time and his dad didn't know how to hold a softball bat, to play softball. So he was a motivator. Quick Tillis, who's one of the fighters he trained, called him a spirit coach. He wasn't a traditional boxing trainer. There have been some guys in boxing history kind of like him, but no one with the charisma, no one who became the main attraction the way Bundini did. I mean, he was there front and center with Ali for all those classic press conferences where they would taunt Sonny Liston and come up with the rhymes. He was very much a part of the show. And, he was famous even despite the fact that he really wasn't an X's and O's boxing trainer who came up with strategy. You're right. He's a 1 in a million original person. There's no one like him in boxing before or after.
Also sort of like the Zelig-esque quality of his life as well with, it's interesting. It's not just two boxers who are really prominent. It's arguably the two greatest ever, right?
I was doing a radio program earlier today, and the interviewer asked me, "Who are the two greatest fighters of all time?" And I said, if you were to poll boxing writers, say, give me your top 4, everybody would put Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali in their top 4. Everybody. And the connection between these two guys is Drew Bundini Brown. So he had this knack for always popping up at the right place at the right time. He would call it Shorty. He would call it destiny. But you're right. For a guy who didn't have a boxing background, what a privileged position is to be in the gym with the great Sugar Ray Robinson day in and day out for 7 years. And then, of course, Sugar Ray hands him off to the young Cassius Clay in 1964.
Then he pops up in the Shaft movies.
Well, think about it. He was the sidekick to Sugar Ray, Muhammad Ali, and then Shaft. in those classic Shaft movies, he was Willie the gangster, who was a bad guy in the first movie. But once we get to Shaft 2, he's such a popular character, they write him in as sort of a good guy. Him and Shaft become buddies, and he becomes Shaft's sidekick in the sequel.
You know what's interesting about him too is that a lot of the sort of feedback that we've gotten from people with respect to the book is that they were always curious about him, and they would see him in the corner or see him in the Shaft movie, or it's interesting. He was sort of peripherally intriguing to a lot of people, and I think the book struck a chord for folks in part because of that. I always wondered about him, Bundini.
Kyle,
It was interesting.
I never told you this, but here's when I knew we had something special. Early in the research, I interviewed some of Muhammad Ali's biographers, and these are people who wrote classic Muhammad Ali books. But by the time I interviewed these guys, I had already formed a really strong relationship with Bundini's son. I'd read his father's poetry. I'd read his father's personal writings. I really got to know Kalia Ali, who he was there with Bundini in the early days. And when I interviewed those Ali biographers, they didn't know much about Bundini. They didn't know what I knew. And I knew right then that, we've all been fascinated by this guy. We've all been intrigued, but he's very much an enigma. Even the top Muhammad Ali scholars didn't really know his origin story, where he came from. It's like he came out of nowhere. And so early on, I decided what I was going to try to do is trace his footsteps from Sanford, Florida, to Harlem, to Muhammad Ali's corner for some of the greatest fights in history.
I think that's the thing that sort of pulls people in about him, is that he was this mysterious sort of street poet, especially in the documentary When We Were Kings, which won an Academy Award, I think, in 1996.
That's right.
I remember early, I was probably 25 at that time, and I think that little speech that he gave, which was an absolute tour de force in that documentary, just like verbally, just so out there in the best sense, and it's just, who is this guy? And I think that he has that effect, and it extends beyond boxing. The idea that Ali had this sort of wizard, they call him different things, Svengali, the good witch doctor.
All kinds of different phrases have been used to describe him.
Yep.
And a lot of folks who were on the outside of Muhammad Ali's entourage couldn't quite figure why Ali had him around. So part of what I wanted to do is to strip away that mythos, that persona, because he had a larger than life charismatic persona. I wanted you to see him as a father, as a husband, as a son. So I had to sort of get deep into the Brown family story so that you could see who the man was and how he picked up that charisma along the way. He was a hustler in the positive sense of the term. When he's a little boy in Sanford, he sees all these naval officers come into town. The air station Sanford is formed in 1942. And he sees all these guys in their fancy shoes because he's downtown in Sanford shining shoes of the officers. And he says to himself, how do I get some clothes like that? He was drawn to people who dressed nice and looked important. And he signs up for the Navy when he's not even 18 years old. He lies about his age because he's a tall kid. He looks older than he is. And he joins the Navy before he's 18 just so he can get the bow tie, just so he could get the uniform. And in the Navy, he travels the world as a teenager, as a naval steward, shining shoes, cooking in the kitchen, waiting on the officers. But it was the uniform that attracted him. So I think even at a very young age, he was attracted to people of prominence. He was attracted to slick talkers and slick dressers. And that was one of the mysteries that I uncovered in the book, is why did Bundini wear the bow tie in the corner when he was working behind? No boxing trainers wear bow ties, by the way. You don't need to be a boxing expert to know that. But he wore the bow tie because he loved it when he wore that and when he was in the Navy. He liked the outfit. He liked the cardigan. He liked the look that he had as a naval steward. He brought that with him to the boxing world.
Yeah, he took his job very seriously too, Todd.
He sure did.
Just in terms of, I think Drew the third, his son, was talking about. I can't remember the fight, but maybe I read this somewhere too, but in your book and elsewhere, like the sort of ritualistic sort of attention to detail that he brought to the pre-fight.
Yeah,
Sort
it,
of
that reminded me.
preparation.
That reminded me of my own father, because when my dad worked corners, he would go into the locker room and he would set out his Q-tips. He would set out the towels. He would have everything in a very meticulous spot. And one of Bundini's jobs for Ali was to set up the locker room. So he would go to the arena a couple hours before the champ and get his boots just like he liked them, get everything set up in the locker room, get everything perfect. And the minute Ali walked through the door, he started with the rhymes. He started with the hype. He started juicing Ali up and getting him ready to go to battle. I think I could be sympathetic to that because my dad was very much that kind of trainer where everything had to be right. And he almost treated it like it was a religious ceremony. Everything had to be the same way every time. And Bundini was a attention to detail kind of guy. And him dressing up, having the bow tie and the outfit was a way to feel like you're ready for battle, ready for him to do his job.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it speaks to the exigencies of the sport of boxing, and first of all, that sort of maybe people do that in baseball and all that, but the seriousness of boxing with the violence sort of requires that attention to detail first. Second, if you think about just and I'd love you to sort of speak to this is how Ali's brother Rahman thought that maybe Ali would have lost more fights if it wasn't for Bundini, and in other words, like, and how many times did he get fired, but he was always brought back.
Yeah.
The value that Bundini sort of represented to Ali is pretty significant, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who say, "Oh, Bundini wasn't a boxing trainer. He never boxed. What does he know about boxing?" There are people who say that about him. But it tickled me when I read Rahman Ali, Ali's brother, wrote a recent book, and he said my brother would have lost probably 4 more fights than he did if it wasn't for Bundini keeping him straight in the gym and keeping him straight in between rounds. I could be sympathetic to that as well, because in my father's gym, I would watch guys lose the fight in the locker room. By the time they walked out of the locker room, they were ready to go lose. Their confidence just dropped once the crowd was there, once the lights were bright. I watched so many really talented fighters lose fights by psyching themselves out, not being mentally ready. And Teddy Atlas and a lot of famous boxing trainers have said 80% of boxing is mental. Most of us never want to get into a fight. We don't want someone to punch us in the face. Most of us never want to be in that situation. But boxers, that's where they live and work and make their money. So much of it is getting yourself mentally ready. And Bundini was there to do that for Ali. Ali needed the rhymes. He needed it to be fun. He needed the trash talk for himself. It really wasn't as much to psych the other guy out. It was to get him ready for battle. And Bundini understood what made Ali tick. Angelo Dundee once said, he charges Ali's batteries. And that's certainly what he did.
Right. What about just in terms of the nature of their relationship? They're almost like brothers.
Yeah, it's funny.
Loved each other like brothers.
My favorite quote is when I interviewed Muhammad Ali's wife. I said, how would you compare their friendship? And she said, they're Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And I love that. I thought it was a great way to put it. I didn't ask which one was Tom Sawyer and which one was Huck Finn. I wish I would have, but I didn't ask that question. She said, the rhyming and the teasing and they were 2 ornery little boys together, and they brought out the worst in each other in some ways. I tried to really tell the story of their friendship in this book, because as much as they were best friends, they hit some rough patches here and there in their friendship, and they had some falling outs. He was fired 8 to 12 times. Now, everyone gave me a different number. Some people said, no, it was 8 times. Some people said, no, he was fired 12 times. Well, it doesn't really matter. What we know is that he got fired a lot and always brought back. Ali would always bring him back for the next fight. So I tried to profile some of the tough parts of their relationship. I wanted to show the full panoramic of, a friendship that lasted 21 years. They were best friends in a lot of ways.
What do you think about Bundini as sort of a misunderstood figure in a lot of different ways? I think that
Yeah.
over the course of doing the book, um, you and I had several conversations about how we each sort of knew people in our lives who were sort of similar to him, maybe hustlers and
Yeah.
fast talkers who were we appreciated but weren't necessarily appreciated by
Sure.
other. I think Bundini gets a sort of like a bad rap in a lot of respects because I think a lot of people misunderstood him. What do you think about that? His
Yeah.
style and all
Let
that.
me explain a little bit about this. There's this whole contingent of people who really don't like Bundini because it was well known that he sold Ali memorabilia as a side gig. Ali would wear a pair of trunks in sparring, and after sparring was over, Bundini would sell those trunks to some fan who was there to watch, so he would do that kind of thing. And people were aware of it, and Muhammad Ali was aware of it. I talked to Kalia, who was Ali's wife for 10 years, and said, what did Ali think of him doing that? Because it's well known that he would sell, Ali hand wraps and all this different stuff. And she said Ali didn't mind one bit that he did that. And in fact, he would have much rather Bundini do that than ask for money. Because, with Bundini, you got a guy who dropped out of school in the 2nd grade. With Bundini, you have a guy who couldn't read and write on an adult level. With Bundini, you have a guy who was paid essentially in cash after the fight. He never signed a contract with Ali. He never signed a contract with Sugar Ray Robinson. 1, because he couldn't read or afford a lawyer. 2, he didn't trust contracts. It was a handshake agreement. So he wasn't good with money. He didn't save for the future. And it is pretty miraculous when you think his son goes on to become a Navy jet pilot. His son goes on to be a college basketball player, 1st-generation college graduate, and then an author and a motivational speaker. Bundini's teaching and philosophies were inspirational, but he was a flawed man. He was someone who he would sell Ali stuff on the side to make a little extra cash. So there were these people who from the outside saw him as a leech or as a yes man or something like that. It really isn't until you dig deep into the friendship and learn about what the Ali inner circle has to say about him that you really see how much he meant to the champion and to anyone who was a part of his family. He was a family man.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say he loved his son. He was a family man in some ways.
I was going to say, Todd, too, some of the friction in terms of the financial arrangement and just the tension in general in the camp was between Bundini and the Nation of Islam.
Absolutely.
Which wasn't helped by the fact that Bundini married a Jewish woman in the 1950s. He drank. And, also, I'll leave it at this and let you sort of expand on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the Nation of Islam, like, Bundini totally stood up to them, and they were basically gangsters in many respects. And he didn't care. Like he really had he had a lot of courage, like cojones.
Yeah. You have to remember Ali, a couple years before he becomes Muhammad Ali, becomes heavily influenced by the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of that organization. Ali had sort of become enraptured by their rhetoric and interested in that organization, and it transformed his life. And of course, that's why he takes the name Muhammad Ali. It's given to him by Elijah Muhammad. When Muhammad does join the nation officially and changes his name, there are certain people who are sort of exiled from his life. Bundini was a bad example in a lot of ways, because 1, here we have in Muhammad Ali's corner a guy who wears the Star of David necklace. He had married, as you said, a white Jewish woman named Rhoda Palestine from Brighton Beach, New York. This is at a time where a black man from Florida marrying a white Jewish woman from New York City was very, very taboo. And the Nation of Islam knew in Ali's corner is a black man married to a white woman who's Jewish, who wears the Star of David necklace for every fight. He was also a drinker. He loved to drink, and it was well known that he liked to go to jazz clubs, and he liked nightlife. They viewed Bundini as a bad influence. And Ali was supposed to represent the Nation of Islam and represent their agenda. And, part of the friction had to do with he stood up to the teachings of the nation, and he stood up to Elijah Muhammad. And there's this great quote from Elijah. He said, if I had 10 men like Bundini, I could rule the world. Because that might have been the one person that Elijah Muhammad couldn't out-argue was Bundini. He did stand up to the nation in a lot of different periods of his relationship with Muhammad Ali. And it caused friction, and it caused him to get fired a few times. But that was a big part of chapter 4. We talk about that relationship and that friction.
Yeah, Todd, I think one of the cool things that you did with the book as well is sort of uncovering to a great degree some of the relationships that Bundini had with other boxers. For example, George Foreman, who, you know, Ali's arguably his greatest win was in the Rumble in the Jungle.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people didn't know that George Foreman, for example, was friends with Bundini, and then Bundini had other friends, if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah. When I interviewed George Foreman for this book, I assumed that George Foreman had never met him until they faced off in Africa, or maybe the pre-fight press conference in New York City before they went to Africa to train. I was wrong about that. George had a relationship with Bundini that went back about 5 or 6 years prior to that match. While Muhammad Ali is in exile, George happens to meet Bundini in New York City. He's fighting on the undercard of a fight at Madison Square Garden, and they become close friends and remain friends and stay in close contact for 4 or 5 years. That was at a time where it looked like Ali would never fight again. That was at a time where it looked like Ali maybe headed to prison for draft evasion. So when Ali comes back and, you know, finally fights his way back to a title fight against George Foreman, Bundini's kind of caught in the middle. He was not only friends with Muhammad Ali, but he was also friends with George Foreman. So it's a brand new way to view that fight, is to see it through that sort of friendship triangle of Bundini, Ali, and Big George. And George loved him so much and admired him so much. You know, George said to me, you know, he did the interview at a drop of a hat because he felt like Ali would have wanted his best friend to get his own book, His Day in the Sun. And I would have never dreamed how close they were. You know, Bundini had a lot of high-profile boxing friends. He had a lot of high-profile friends in the jazz world, too. Folks like Miles Davis, and, you know, he had friends who were in the writing world, like James Baldwin, who was a friend of Bundini's. George Plimpton was a good friend of Bundini's. And, of course, Shaft. You know, he had a lot of movie star friends, too, because he was in 6 different Hollywood films. You know, he worked with Oprah. He worked with Whoopi Goldberg. So, you know, he knew everybody. Like you said, he popped up everywhere. And he had some very famous friends.
Well, I think, you know, what I sort of noticed about him, you know, sort of what I knew before, and then obviously editing and reading your book, is like he was sort of a star in his own right. You know, he was in Harlem, and
Mm-hmm.
people would call out his name on the street, calling him the Black Prince, and you know, he wasn't just a sidekick. He was sort of a,
Yeah.
you know, Ali was the star when they were,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in relationship to Ali. Ali was the star, but he was sort of a star on his own right.
Well, it was interesting when I interviewed Gene Kilroy, who was Ali's business manager, and he set up all the training camps. I said, Gene, tell me about the first time you met Bundini. And he said, well, I met him in Harlem at Birdland at a jazz club before I ever met Muhammad Ali. And I said, hold on, how do you remember? He was nobody back then. And he said in the jazz world, you know, people called him the Black Prince. That was his nickname back then. And he had a lot of famous jazz friends, and he was there sort of hanging out with all these prominent jazz people. And in Harlem, he was kind of a somebody, you know, in that neighborhood, in that particular part of New York City. He was well known in that circle. You're right. He had this magnetic presence that if you knew him, you loved him. I didn't interview a single person who didn't like him. And several times when I went into the interviews, you know, even with Larry Holmes, who can be kind of surly and cranky sometimes, everyone I talked to just gushed about him and loved him and had a story to tell me. And, you know, he made them laugh. He made them cry. You know, he had a magnetic personality. I think some people just have that it factor, and he was one of those people.
Well, it's interesting just in terms of, say, his celebrity in Harlem. He was the poem. You know, he wasn't really a poet. He wasn't a musician. Like his art was his personality.
Yeah.
Think about it. which I always, it's sort of a fascinating thing, you know, in
Yeah.
life you encounter people like that. And I think he was one of those people.
But you had mentioned this earlier, and I didn't really get to it. You were talking about what it means to love someone like Bundini. Look, we don't hide from his flaws. He had trouble with alcohol. He had trouble in his marriage. He had trouble in some of his business dealings. He opened a bar in Manhattan called Bundini's World, and he was his own best customer. His son was honest with me about that. But, I do know what it's like to love flawed people. And we've all had a Bundini in our life, someone who just makes us better. It could be a teacher, be a coach. I mean, we've all had someone who gets us to our core. And he was the kind of person, if you knew him, you loved him. If you were around him, you didn't want him to leave. He just had that sort of magnetic personality. And I wrote in the book that his weapon was the English language. But you could argue that his weapon was his personality, his way with people. He could read people like we read books. He was just a street smart dude. That's what he was.
Hey Todd, what about sort of the current sort of cultural meaning of the word Bundini? What is it sort of turned into? Like on Twitter, so many years after he died in 1987, people say what?
Yeah, say, who's your Bundini? Or this person's my Bundini. It's interesting, like, I remember when Obama was first coming on the political scene, I pick up on this stuff because I'm a boxing guy. It was on CNN. Someone said Joe Biden was his Bundini. And I thought, what? The word Bundini has become synonymous with your sidekick, your best friend, your confidant. And that term is sort of, his name, Bundini, his nickname, has sort of morphed into this idea of who is your guy, who's your person, who makes you better, picks you up, who is your bro, or whatever you want to call it. That term Bundini now sort of is a part of the vernacular a lot of young people in the hip hop world use. You know, your Bundini is your go-to, your confidant, you know. So that relationship, now has sort of changed the English language.
And one scene in the book that really, I think you've gotten a lot of really positive feedback, and I've heard it, is the end of Bundini's life. It's a very moving part of the book. If you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, it was one of the really cool parts of the research is, Bundini's life sort of ends tragically. He falls down a flight of steps and he becomes quadriplegic. He'd been out drinking one night and fell down some steps. And he's in the hospital. He can't move his arms or his legs, and his neck is in a halo. And the people in the room were his son, Drew Brown III, and a guy named Victor Solano, who was one of Muhammad Ali's close friends in Los Angeles. I got to interview both people who were in the room when Ali came to the hospital and was given his chance to say goodbye to his best friend. So, I just feel so tremendously blessed to have the opportunity to interview the people who were in the room for that intimate moment, and to get to bring it back to life for people to see their sort of goodbye to each other. And of course, Ali, he ends it with, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and they do the routine one last time. And I feel like that was a scene I had to get it right. I think we got some questions coming in. Cool.
Yes, we actually have our first audience question is from Jack Reitmeyer, who, Todd, you may have met. He's a reporter also for the Times-Union. And Jack, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Great, thank you. Good to see you, Rachel. Todd, nice to meet you. Thank you for your book. I'm enjoying it very much. I look forward to, having my own little interview with you. As a fan of like the old days of boxing, I remember those days so well. There was just something about that wide world of sports, the fight on the Saturday afternoon. And of course, we know that boxing it's not anything like it was. And I'm wondering if you enjoyed like reliving those days and what has happened with boxing? Why does it just not have that electricity that it had at that time?
Well, there's a couple different ways I can answer that, Jack. You got to remember, in Muhammad Ali's day, there's no NBA. There's no MMA. There's so much competing for the attention of young people today. We got, you know, the NFL wasn't big like that back in Ali's day. It wasn't as powerful as it is now. There was no sort of around the clock sports coverage. So, you know, you think today there's a million different sports and, you know, different sort of cultural mediums competing for young people's attention, right? So back in Ali's day, if you were the heavyweight champion of the world, you were likely the most famous athlete in America. Ali was the most famous athlete on planet Earth. So, you know, he transcended even boxing. It wasn't like, for me as a writer, going back and reliving those days, because my whole childhood, my dad had an elaborate collection of fight films. So I had watched those fights a million times in my life before ever, you know, doing this research. But what I did get to do was go back and watch every Muhammad Ali fight again, watching Bundini. Because, you know, you're watching Ali, he's so charismatic and so brilliant, you can't help but just keep your eyes fixated on him. I rewatched every fight, but only to watch in the corner and to get Bundini down. And his son was telling me stories. Go watch the Ernie Schaefer's fight. My daddy does this. And then I could go watch the tape and look for what he's telling me. And, you know, sometimes his son would tell me some extravagant story and I would say, yeah, sure, right. Then I would watch the tape and it would be there. I would say, oh my God, he's not kidding. So it was different going back and reliving those fights, only watching for the trainer. Nobody does that. So that was a new way of seeing it for me. In regard to boxing's popularity now, you know, I still think boxing is popular. I still think boxing isn't dying. You hear people write these articles that say boxing's about to disappear. Well, there's articles from the 1920s that said that too. Boxing will always be around as long as there's poor people and people in those tough inner city areas that need a way out. Boxing gets its clientele from the bottom crust. So it'll always be around, but it may never be what it was as far as being the heavyweight champion, meaning you're the most famous athlete. We may never see that again. But boxing history is kind of cyclical. It has bad periods, down periods, then it comes back. Boxing was in bad shape in the 80s until Tyson came back. Then Tyson kind of brought some new air into boxing again. So, you know, I wouldn't write boxing's obituary yet. Although certainly now these guys are not nearly as famous as Sugar Ray or Muhammad Ali. These guys were superstars, you know, like LeBron James is today.
Right. All right.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you so much. We have another question here from Sean. Sean, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Todd.
Hey, what's up, Sean?
Hey, great job on the book. And
Thank
just
you.
to share with the audience, I mean, I ran into Todd quite a few times at Starbucks when he was in the process of writing this particular book. So all through the whole pandemic, I walked in the Northshire Bookstore up in Saratoga, and I'm like, oh my God, there it is. Staring at me in the yellow cover saying, it's here, you know, and it was almost like a Christmas gift in the middle of September. And he did a great job with it. And I mean, I discovered Todd on his first book through 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym with his about his relationship with his father and all the great characters that were in that book. And I've shared that with others, and they loved the whole writing of that book. And Todd got some new fans out of that as well too. So when I got Bundini, I was just like, I couldn't wait to break into it. And because I would have some, you know, informal discussions with Todd, just because I'm a boxing fan growing up too, and just to get to see where he was in the process. So it was great to get that feedback on where he was in the process, and then kind of see the finished product and be able to, you know, read the great book that he had. And like, you know, Kyle was saying about the end of the book and his death, and how a lot of people, you know, had admired the writing there. And I also admired the end of the book too, like the last chapter, maybe so about the father-son relationships, I guess. And that really touched me. And I thought that, I mean, I just was kind of reading it and just kind of lost myself in those words. And you did a great job on that last chapter. I think that hit me more than anything. That last chapter, you did such a great job on it. And then I was hoping acknowledgments. I was at least listed as an honorable mention for your friends at Starbucks on Troy Schenectady Road.
You know, I'm gonna put you in there next time. It's funny that he mentions that in the acknowledgments to the book. I thank the good folks at the Starbucks on Troy Schenectady Road, because I really did write every word of this book at the same Starbucks, at the same table. And Sean would come in and he would see I'd have all my Ali books spread out and I'd have my coffee. And I just liked that environment so much that I was in a groove. I'm sort of superstitious. It was coming and it was working. So I just stayed there. And sometimes I would get phone calls from famous boxing people and have to go out on the patio and do interviews. I interviewed Angelo.
Oh, here's George Foreman. I got to go out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would do. But, you know, I did see you when actually, I don't know if you remember this, on the very first day I started the book, you had came in and I told you about getting the book deal. And so Sean was with me on the very first day when I wrote the first words. And a couple times he checked in, you know, he checked in along the way. When
it was great. I mean, to share the story when I discovered you. So when I read 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym, I don't even know. I didn't even know if your picture was on it because I think I got the paperback version. So anyways, when I went to Northshire, I used to go to Northshire routinely at Saratoga on every Friday. And then when you were doing the book signing for 12 Rounds of Lowe's Gym, they had the poster up in Northshire. It said, there's that guy I used to see at Starbucks all the time. He wrote that book, you know, with the Elvis Costello glasses and everything. And I'm like,
let me tell you,
I know this guy.
One time
I could see you there writing. I said, he has to be doing something because every time you have your Apple computer and you'd be typing and you'd be thinking for a minute. And I could see, I said, he's got to be a writer. And so I read the book before I knew who exactly the author was and realized that I had crossed his paths many times in the same cafe. And so this was such a great, it just was a great moment to walk in there and all of a sudden see it displayed on the shelves when I walked in. And I guess my question too is that I was surprised, especially when you put in the front, the cover of the book is a George Foreman quote, and I realized that how much Foreman was a fan of Bundini, especially you would think because Foreman had that, like, I don't know if I guess to say heel. I mean, I was born in '67, so when he was, my father always said, like in '73, '74, like before he fought Ali, I mean, he was Mike Tyson of the '70s, and maybe something even more vicious than that.
He was.
And to think that, he had that admiration for his opponent who basically ended his first career,
right.
And had that admiration for the person that fueled Ali to beat him and end his first career. Because, I mean, the Foreman Ali fight didn't end Foreman's first career, was Jimmy Young. But it was just like, I guess my question is, did Foreman talk more about his state of mind, I guess, during those times and how Bundini had the effect on him? I guess that really touched me through the whole book, is Foreman not realizing how much of a impact he had on him.
Yeah, you're correct. George Foreman, for those who didn't watch his early career, was Mike Tyson, the original version. He was stoic. He didn't like reporters. He was surly. He was mean. He's not the bald, heavy-set guy who we know now as a preacher and George Foreman grills and all that stuff. He was a tough guy. He was mean. He was from the streets of Fifth Ward, Houston. He was from a really tough part of Houston. Yes, when he first met Bundini in New York, he said he was kind of in awe of him because he had seen him with Ali at the Liston fight, and he was kind of starstruck. They struck up a friendship, and Bundini gave him lots of advice, things he had learned from Sugar Ray, and all the boxers looked up to Sugar Ray. So they exchanged phone numbers and had correspondence. And when George would win a fight, if it was in New York, Bundini was there. And that was one of the reasons he got fired from Ali's entourage once, is that when Foreman beat Frazier, Bundini was there celebrating with him on camera. And Ali saw that as like being a traitor. You're my guy, you're not his guy. And Ali fired him for that. Now he brought him back. But Ali got a little jealous that, they were that close. And I said to George, George, that had to be hard. I know some of that's showmanship for the cameras, but Bundini talked a lot of trash to you. And, the real champ is back and all that stuff that he was saying in Africa. And George, we're doing the interview just like me and you are doing right now. He looked at me and he said, I excused it. And I knew that's, he didn't like it, but he excused it because he loved Bundini. They were friends. And he knew that, he said, as much as Bundini loved me, I knew he loved Ali even more. And he just excused it. There was no real friction there, although Bundini was part of that trash talk machine, and Ali did a lot of trash talking for that fight.
Hey, Todd, I'll jump in. What about the Foreman's second career?
Yeah, no, that's something I didn't know.
Bundini being with them, right?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. George said when he decided to do his comeback, and he's the George we know now. He's old and bald, and, you know, people are laughing at his comeback. Bundini was the first person he called, and he wanted Bundini to come help him train and help him with the comeback. If you remember, Angelo Dundee, Ali's original trainer, was Foreman's trainer for the comeback. And Bundini was sort of sick at the time, and alcoholism was getting the best of him. And they talked and met and discussed Bundini being a part of that comeback. Unfortunately, Bundini died with the freak accident before George really got deep into his comeback. I think he fought twice before Bundini passed away. But Bundini would tell him, when you get your title shot, I'll be there. You're going to be champ again. Shorty wants you to be the champ again, is what he would tell him on the phone. And who would have dreamed George at age 45 would indeed become the heavyweight champion again? And, you know, one of the great stories I heard was after Ali beat Foreman in Africa, Bundini came to the locker room and he told George, you'll be champ again, but not on your time, on Shorty's time. And who would have dreamed it would be 1994 before George would get to wear that belt again? And what trunks was George wearing that night? The trunks he wore in Zaire, the same trunks that when he got knocked out by Muhammad Ali. So I asked George about that, and he said, you know, Bundini was looking down on me. He knew it was my time. It was Shorty's time.
I've got a question for you, Todd.
Sure thing.
So for how did Bundini get into boxing if he didn't have a background in it, if he, you know, wasn't a trainer? I mean, you know, his background's in jazz and being a character in Harlem. I'm curious.
Let me tell you, I was like Sherlock Holmes. I was trying to figure that out too, because, you know, a lot of great boxing trainers would have loved to have been with Ali and Sugar Ray, guys who had the resumes to be with them. But it all starts with, you know, Bundini moves to Harlem after his time in the Navy, and he hangs out. He has an apartment which is directly above Sugar Ray's Golden Glove barbershop, and he hangs out in the barbershop. He has that conch finger wave hairstyle that's popular back in Harlem in those days. And he's just hanging around at the Golden Gloves barbershop, just kind of kicking it, talking in the neighborhood. And one day, Johnny Honeyboy Bratton, the former welterweight champion, walks in, and they get into a little argument. Someone says, hey, this guy was a world champion. And Bundini says, he's no world champion. Look at him. He's too pretty. You don't have any scars. This guy can't fight. And he's teasing Johnny Bratton. Well, Johnny says, you come to the gym tonight, and I'll show you I can fight. Well, Bundini does, and he keeps with the teasing. Oh, you can't fight. You're too pretty, you know, all this stuff. I guess Johnny put it on a sparring partner, kind of showing off for Bundini. And one of Johnny Bratton's cohorts says, hey, you need to come back to the gym, get him hyped up. This is the best he's looked in years. So those two just become friends. And through his relationship with Johnny Bratton, he eventually gets to meet Sugar Ray. And it is Johnny Bratton who introduces him to Sugar Ray Robinson, who instantly falls for that Bundini charm. And when he first starts working with Sugar Ray, the jobs that he takes part in are very low-level jobs. He even babysits Sugar Ray's kids for a period. And then they become friends, and Sugar Ray invites him to training camp. And for 7 years, he learns what it means to be champion, watching Sugar Ray train day in and day out. By the end of that 7-year relationship, he's one of the guys, one of the upper crust guys in the entourage. So I guess Shorty. That's my answer, is that Shorty put him in the right barbershop at the right time. That's the best I can answer it.
Well, Todd, Kyle, I think that about wraps us up. Thank you guys so much. This has been a fascinating event, and I look forward to watching some old clips with Bundini and watching this. What a fascinating. Thank you all both so much. This has been a great event.
Thank you.
The book is Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. Todd Snyder, thank you so very much. This has been fantastic. We hope to see you all soon at another Northshire Live event around.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and the folks who watch on YouTube. We appreciate it. And, you know, if you check out the book, look me up on Sienna's website. I'm happy to talk to people via email. I love hearing from readers. It's a treat.
Yes, thank you so much, you guys. This was fabulous. And thank you to the audience. We'll see you all again at another great Northshire Live event coming up soon. Take care and have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care and good evening.